I'm MeshCentral, and in this video we're going to take a look at MeshCentral's integration with LDAP. So LDAP is a technology used widely, especially in the Windows world, where it's a directory where you have lots and lots of different objects, but notably in our case, there's objects for all the user accounts that you have in your organization. And so this could be very useful if you want to connect MeshCentral to LDAP so that instead of people having to create their own user accounts inside MeshCentral, they can log in to MeshCentral using the credentials that they already have in the organization. So we're going to take a look at a couple of slides on LDAP, just the basics of it. And I'm really no expert in LDAP, so I got to learn about it myself. And we are going to take a look at how to integrate MeshCentral with LDAP. So quick slide here. This is, so basically you have a directory of users, and it includes not only information about the users like their name, phone numbers, and so on, things like that, but it also has the credentials of the users, so MeshCentral can query the LDAP directory for whether a user has the correct password or not. So it's not only user information, but also user authentication. And so what you would do is you would tie in MeshCentral to your LDAP directory. And usually that's a Windows domain controller, but it can also be Open LDAP directory or another LDAP server. And so there's a standardized protocol for MeshCentral or any client to connect to LDAP. And there's also a standardized way to query objects and to set objects and so on. And so the goal will be to have two things. First, allow users from the login screen to type in their username and password and log in. And they will never have created an account on MeshCentral. They will simply use their credentials from LDAP. And then the second thing is that when the user is inside MeshCentral, we want to have some information from the LDAP directory go into MeshCentral so that we make it look good. So we have the right username. If we use SMS, we want to have the right phone number. If we have a user image, we want to have the image here, and so on. So that it kind of looks like a seamless integration. MeshCentral will look like it's well integrated inside your organization. Okay, so in order to set up MeshCentral with your LDAP folder or directory, you will have to go in your config.json and do a few changes. Now we're going to make changes in the domain section, and in my case here, the default domain for my default, for my server. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to say auth LDAP. This is going to say that this domain here, this default domain, is authenticated. Everybody who's going to be in that domain is going to be authenticated using LDAP. And so you can't have a mix here. You can't have some users authenticated using username and password, some using something else, and then some LDAP. The entire domain for MeshCentral for that domain will be authenticated using a set of users inside a specific LDAP directory. Okay, then you have LDAP options. Now the LDAP options are a set of options that are passed to a library that MeshCentral uses to connect to the LDAP server. Now MeshCentral uses LDAP auth fork. So if you want to take a look at this URI here, and I'll pull it up real quick. So I'm going to, oh, there we go, I have it. It's on NPM, LDAP auth fork, and 27,000 weekly downloads. And it tells you here how to use this library. But more importantly, there's a set of configuring options like the URI, the binding credentials, search scope, group, and so on and so forth. And there's an example here of parameters that you would pass to this library. So what I just want to focus on is that the parameters that are in LDAP options right there are passed as is to this library there for the purpose of connection. Okay, so let's take a look at what's inside LDAP options. You'll have the URI. Now this is the address, the place where the library needs to connect for the LDAP server. Now there's LDAP or LDAP with an S at the end. And now the one with an S at the end will be with TLS. The one without S will be without TLS. And if you do TLS, there's a different port that you have to usually set up. But a lot of LDAP servers will accept both non-TLS and TLS. Obviously, you want to use TLS as much as possible for security reasons. Now, the binding domain name, this is the user you will be connecting MeshCentral with. So when you connect to the LDAP directory, you need to authenticate yourself so that you, as an administrator, so that you have to prove that you have the rights to access and query the LDAP directory. And so here I am going to connect as a full administrator. So this is the name of my administrator, com sample user administrator, and then the password that you will use to authenticate. And then there's two other parameters here that are important. One is the search base. This is where to look inside the directory for the list of users. So you'll specify this. And then when you are querying for a user, you query for their username. So if somebody types a username and password, how do you match up the username with an entity inside the directory? And so name, for example, equals, and then the username that the user typed. So name here would be what is matched. So it would look at this name and say, aha, the user typed their username, and I can find at this location in the directory a name that matches what the user typed in. So then that will be the user that will try to authenticate against, and the password will be authenticated against. Okay. So that gets us connected to the LDAP server, and it gets us authenticated through the login screen. The last part, and these lines at the bottom here, these allow MeshCentral to pull data from the LDAP server whenever a user logs in. So whenever a user logs in, and confirms that it's okay, that the password matches and so on, then MeshCentral will look at the user profile and grab some of the data for its own internal use. And really the data is a unique account identifier, and we'll talk about this. We'll need an account name, so the name that, usually the same name that you would type. So this would probably be name here, would be the account name. And then you have a user email address, so mail, and then the real name. So if you have a separate field in your LDAP for the user's real name, so the username here would be like an account name you type. The real name would be something more complete, like a first name and last name, something like that. And then a phone number, and then a user image. So if you have a JPEG thumbnail of each user inside your LDAP directory, then that would be pulled. Okay, so at first I didn't quite understand myself how LDAP worked too much. And so one way that I really got to understand this really well is by not only setting up a domain controller myself, but getting an LDAP browser. And I found one. So I have this RDP session right here, and I found one here. So it's called the LDAP Soft LDAP browser. So the company I imagine is LDAP Soft, and it's called LDAP browser. And so this is a read-only browser. It doesn't allow you to change anything in the LDAP directory, but I found it super useful for understanding how to connect, Did I have used the right port? Did I use the right passwords? Do I know what I'm doing here? And so before you start coding or start configuring your LDAP server, super practical. So here I have my host name, I have my port, and I have the base place where I want to be located inside the LDAP server. Then the user I'm going to use to log in. And so here the user is in this notation that LDAP understands. But basically, and we'll see that as we browse the folder, and then the password. So I'm going to hit connect here, and then I'm logged in to this LDAP. And so you'll see this is my base, com.vprodemo, and inside the base there's users, and inside users there's administrator. So here, this would be com vprodemo users administrator. That would be the path. And so what you see it right here, distinguished name, com vprodemo users administrator. This string here kind of uniquely identifies this object inside this administrator object inside this folder and inside this LDAP directory. Okay, and then if you look at administrator, there's a bunch of fields here, and you can sort them by alphabetical order or by value and so on. But there's a bunch of fields like the common name, a description, there's the distinguished name, and so on. There's last login, member of, if you're part of various groups, which groups you're part on. And you'll notice the groups here are basically pointers to other objects inside the LDAP directory. And so I'll sort by value here so that, because most of the values here have nothing, but I'll sort just by these. I'll notice that in my case, I use some separate software to set up a JPEG inside the thumbnail photo attribute. So this one is set, but like name, SAM account name, these are important and so on. So anyway, so what you have to understand is that MeshCentral will log in, and then you need to tell MeshCentral which attribute names here to pull inside MeshCentral. And so these names here, you need to make sure that they match to something interesting, because that's what MeshCentral will pull. Okay, so hopefully I was clear. And if you're an LDAP professional, you'll find this super easy. But anyway, one more thing I want to mention before we go into more practical stuff. If you want the username and the real name, you can aggregate multiple attributes of LDAP into that name. So if you want the real name of a user to be, for example, givenName and then another name with a space, you can use these triple brackets and put the attribute name here, space, triple bracket, this other attribute name. And what will happen is that MeshCentral will go find these attributes in the directory for the user that logged in, and will format them correctly to give you the real name string that you want. Okay, and by the way, I think these are the default values. So username is name, male, name, and the thumbnail. There's one thing here to note is the key. So MeshCentral needs a unique identifier for each account. And so by default, so you can use either user key or user binary key. If you use user binary key, it will take the value at this that you mentioned here. So you take the attribute name, and whatever value there is for this attribute, it will just run a hex on it. So objectSid, if you specify this here, then it will take the objectSid, run a hex on it, and that will be used as the unique identifier. But if you want to use a string, then you basically comment this out, and you specify the attribute name for the string you want MeshCentral to use as a unique identifier for each account. Okay, so let's go to MeshCentral and try this out. So a few things here. First of all, I have my trusty MeshCentral server. Let's go right here. And it's already logged in. I'll log out. So I'm back at the login page. And when I run it, if you run it manually, you can do --debug LDAP. And this will just display a few things on the screen when user logs in. It will show you what's going on. And so that's any errors that happen, it will show you the errors on the screen right here. And also, if a user logs in, it will tell you how it pulled that information. So, another thing I want to mention is, well, let's just take a quick look at my config. So my config.json for this server. So, of course, I have a bunch of settings here, domain, but again, this is just like the slide. We have auth LDAP. I have my options here, so this is my LDAP server. Here I used LDAP S, and the port is 636. That's the default LDAP port if you're using TLS. And just for giggles, for my own testing, I put TLS options, reject unauthorized false. Basically, that says, whatever certificate is presented by the domain controller, just accept it. Don't worry about it. But normally, you would put options here to validate the specific certificate of your domain controller. And then I have the administrator I'm going to log in is, my dummy password, where I find the users and the search filter when I type my username. And so that's it. And actually here, we can type, username should probably also match the LDAP username so that the account matches here. Okay, that's good. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put this aside, Control-C, run MeshCentral again with the LDAP debug. And now I get inside the login page here, I'm going to log in as administrator. And I'm going to put my LDAP password. And now when I hit enter, oops, I'm going to spell this right. Okay, my LDAP password, enter. And there we go. Now we're logged in. Now, this is interesting. So you'll see here the username was not found correctly. So it put my the identifier as my username. And so you see here it says user logged in. The identifier that was used for the account, this is it. And then the username, I used the identifier because I couldn't find the field. Then the email address, it's undefined, I couldn't find that. And then the real name, the phone, I couldn't find that. And then the image is the image that's in the LDAP server right here. Okay, so, and by the way, this is resynchronized every time I log in. So if I change the image and delete it right there, then if I stop the server, starting up again and re-log in, it's just going to resync the image every time. So I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to, log out, administrator, my LDAP password, and then if you go back here, you'll see the picture has been set up again. And also, if you look at if you're administrator and you look at the server events, you'll see an event every time MeshCentral has to resync the LDAP values with the user account. So whenever values are out of sync and needs to resync, there's an event that's generated server-wide. Now, I'm not administrator on this on my own MeshCentral server here, but otherwise you would see these events. Okay, so let's go and fix this. I'm going to go back to my JSON, my config.json here, and I'm going to put the username as the SAM account name. And by the way, the SAM account name, if I go inside the browser and I look for SAM account name, you'll see the values administrator right there. So what that means is that the LDAP username will be whatever value is in the SAM account name. So it should be administrator. So I'm going to try this again. Run. Okay. Then I'm going to log out, log back in, and my password. And there we go. And then you'll see here, it says welcome administrator. And of course I have the image and so on. But I can be quite goofy, you know, in setting up like the name, the real name, the phone number, and so on, any way I like. Okay, a couple of other things. Let's try on purpose not having the right password. So I'm just going to type some junk password, and you'll see here it says LDAP no such user. So that's the error you see when MeshCentral can connect to the LDAP server correctly, but it didn't find the user that was typed in. I want to try with the wrong password. So I'm going to write the right username, wrong password, and then you'll see here it says invalid credentials. Okay, but this is, again, MeshCentral was able to log into the LDAP server. That wasn't the problem. But then the problem is that the user here was wrong. Now, what I want to do is try, I'm going to put 2 here as the binding password. So this is a wrong, incorrect password. So now MeshCentral will not be able to log into the LDAP. So I'm just going to type some random stuff. And then you'll see here, invalid credential error. So this error happens when MeshCentral can't log in to the LDAP server. It doesn't have the right credentials. So I just wanted you to see this just for better debugging. Now there's another thing I want to show, and that is at the bottom here, there's LDAP save user to file. This is an extra key I added just for debugging purposes. And so whenever a user logs in, all the information about that user from LDAP gets saved into this file. So this is useful when you're debugging stuff and you're like, okay, what do I match up with what? You know, what's MeshCentral's perspective of my LDAP server? So I'm going to open, I think it's temp, there it goes. So c:/temp/ this file, it's right here. And what I'm going to do is delete it. And I'm going to correct this. I'm going to run my server again. And this time I am going to log in. And as soon as I log in, you should see the file show up in this folder. So I'm going to go log in. Administrator, password. Okay, so now I logged in, and you see this file is created. And then if I double click on it, this is in Notepad. And just for, yeah, I don't want a word wrap. But anyway, it just says this is the distinguished name, the N for the administrator. This is the common name. And then you see all this information, like the thumbnail photo, and this is the JPEG, and so on. So this is all the information about the administrator that MeshCentral got. And so any field in here, those are fields that can be used by MeshCentral for either the account identifier, the username, the real name, the phone number, thumbnail. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So you get to construct those fields from the data in the LDAP directory. So obviously, this file that I just showed you is exactly the same information that if you used an LDAP browser, you would find right here. The only difference is all the fields that are empty here will not show up in that file. MeshCentral doesn't get empty fields. But otherwise, all the fields here just showed up in the debug file. Okay, so anyway, hopefully that was useful. This is how you connect MeshCentral to an LDAP server. I'm not a super specialist in this, but using a browser and a little bit of technique and a little bit of help online, I was able to get it working, and it works really, really well, including with the picture I think it's a wonderful way to get MeshCentral to work inside your organization without having to create a whole bunch of new user accounts inside the MeshCentral database. Anyway, hopefully that was great. Thank you very much. Have a great day.